All right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. So we are officially done with all of our IB related content. A little bit of updating. I think this is going to be kind of an ongoing process as we get more information from the district. Um, it looks like May 20th is the last day that we can assign stuff, or like we'll have stuff due, I should say. After May 20th, you should have nothing due in any of your classes. That includes finals. It's all done. That's their call on that. So that gives us a little bit of time to I think about 4.5 weeks to cover some non IB mandated stuff. They have also given the go ahead. Previously, they said no summative assessments. Now they're saying it's okay to do summative assessments. So I'm going to put up a kind of like survey on Classroom to see what you guys think about this. We don't need to do another assessment if you guys don't want to, but I'm going to check to see if you do want to. If you do, it would probably be a apartheid paper 2 sometime probably next week. We'd probably have to figure out like a 1 hour time frame where I could have it up to kind of give that time allotment to it. But we'll figure that out. We'll play it by ear based on what the results of the survey I put up are. So that is an option for us now, and we kind of have an idea over kind of what we're going to be looking at here. So I am just going to cover some kind of random topics for us with the idea of trying to cover some stuff that connects into like stuff that's going on now in the world. I decided the first area I want to start with is Asia. I'm not going to lie, a big reason why I'm doing that is because it gives me an excuse to talk about Japanese history, which I almost never get to talk about. So I figured this would be a chance. But the main reason is I want to talk a little bit about North Korea. It's been, we've been distracted by other stuff for a couple of years now. But North Korea pops up in the news a lot. And one of the things I always hear from students when North Korea is in the news is they don't really know what's going on with it. So I thought it might be good. I know you guys talked about the Korean War, but I also know that you went through it pretty quick and you don't really talk about what happens after that. So I thought it might be kind of cool to get a little bit more of an idea, not just of North Korea, but kind of how things are going on over there in general. We're probably not going to focus on China too much, just because you guys had more China talk last year, and they're not going to be as directly connected in here. But I'm going to use the excuse to talk about Japan, and then we'll talk about North Korea next week. For Japan, we do have to actually jump back to World War II really quick for two reasons. Number one, stuff that's going on in Korea as we get to the Korean War and the development of North Korea is kind of inextricably tied to Korea's experience during World War II and then during the Cold War, and Japan's a big part of that. And again, I want to talk about Japan a little bit. And I wanted to start with this one because I've noticed a very interesting thing about how we cover history in America. That very America-centric way of doing it. When we talk about World War II, most of the time students can give me a general summary of what led America to World War II, and what led Europe to World War II, and what led Germany to World War II. Even though Germany was our enemy and they were Nazis and they were clearly bad guys, we still have a general idea of like, okay, they had economic depression going on, and then Hitler came in and kind of scapegoated Jewish people and a lot of people, primarily Jewish though, and scapegoated the West and focused on nationalism and power, and that led them into World War II. But then when I ask what led Japan into World War II, it's always, well, they attacked Pearl Harbor for like no reason, and it was a war crime, so we had to fight back and we had to like beat them and punish them. And Pearl Harbor definitely was a war crime. But it's interesting to me that for America, Japan was like our most personal enemy during World War II, right? Like Germany was our enemy, but they didn't attack us directly, whereas Japan did. And as a result, we pretty much just ignore everything that led Japan to that. A lot of things I hear about Pearl Harbor is like they attacked us for no reason, or they attacked us out of nowhere, and those are both patently untrue. So I wanted to start with just a summarized rundown. It gets less summarized than this. This is from my APUSH class where we've gone over all of this kind of bit by bit throughout the year. So this one is super duper summarized, then a little bit summarized, kind of giving you a better idea of, definitely in no means trying to justify Pearl Harbor, because it was an attack that hit civilians in addition to the military. It was an unannounced attack, not an unprovoked attack as it's often described, but an unannounced attack, which is what makes it a war crime in addition to hitting civilians. But to make it clear again that it wasn't out of nowhere, that it was something that we could have and actually did see coming, and just pushed forward anyway. So Japan kind of has, going into World War II, a background of being snubbed by the West, but particularly by America. Even going back to remember, how was Japan opened up to the world? It was Admiral Perry, an American admiral that came in with gunships and told them that if they did not trade with America, we would kill them. So from the get-go, their experience with America is like, hi, nice to meet you, trade with us or you're going to die. From there, Japan actually puts in the work. They industrialize. They catch up with the rest of the world. They're feeling great. They're feeling like, okay, now we're not going to get looked down on. Now we're not going to get bullied. They start imperializing like the Western world does, and that's when they start running into problems. Because China and Japan go to war. And for pretty much all of Japan's history, China was like this behemoth of a neighbor that they had to be super careful of, and they beat them, and they're super proud of it. And then Russia, France, and Germany roll in, don't even actually have anything to do with the war, but they're like, hey, you took some land from China, you have to give it back right now, that's not okay. That would either never happen in Europe or would result in a massive conflict, right? Imagine Britain comes in, takes control over India, and then Russia, France, and Germany are like, wait a minute, Britain, you have to give that land back. So right away, they're kind of getting this message, okay, Europe doesn't view us as an equal. Europe kind of feels like they can push us around. And then they beat a European country. In the Russo-Japanese War, in the early 1900s, they beat Russia. And yeah, it's Russia. It's you know, it's not the most impressive European country, but they beat a European country and they do it really convincingly. Russia sends this huge naval force all the way around Africa, through India, up to Japan, and then it gets pincer attacked because they lost track of where the Japanese fleet was, and Russia loses their entire fleet. They get destroyed by Japan. Japan could basically demand anything they want at this point. Teddy Roosevelt, again, America stepping in here, comes in to negotiate the peace process. He actually gets a Nobel Peace Prize for doing this, but in the process, he also makes sure that Japan cannot get reparations from Russia. They can't make Russia pay them money, which was normal at the time, but Teddy Roosevelt didn't want to set the precedent of a non-white country taking reparations from a white country. So again, Japan wins, but they're getting snubbed here, and it's a very obvious snub. Everybody else, when they win a war, they get reparations. And then Roosevelt comes in, and not only does he make sure they don't get reparations, he then gets a Nobel Peace Prize for doing that. Then World War I rolls around, and Japan joins the Allies. They join Britain, France, Russia, and America, and Italy, and they're all excited, and they want to get some nice quality territory in Asia, and they get almost nothing. On top of that, they go, hey, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, can we include this thing called a racial equality clause? And it's really simple. All it says is just because people aren't white, that does not mean they are inferior. All races are equal. And they actually get some traction with European countries. Most notably, France is like, yeah, I'm on board with that. That sounds pretty good. Guess who comes in and personally shuts it down? America, specifically Wilson. Woodrow Wilson tells everybody, America will never sign this treaty if the racial equality clause is in it. And funny enough, America never signs the treaty because we failed to ratify the Treaty of Versailles in Congress. But, I mean, they don't know that at the conference, right? So Wilson, America again, scuttles this racial equality clause. So Japan is trying to deal with this diplomatically. They're like, look, okay, you guys have been snubbing us in treaties. It's clear you don't view us as equal. How about we include a clause because we are allies, we fought with you, that we are equal? And the West, specifically America, not only says no, they then go, also you don't get the territory that you want. You get some of it, but not all of it. Britain and France get pretty much everything they want, but no, not you, Japan. Then, in between World War I and World War II, as a follow-up, there's this thing called the Washington Naval Conference. This is signed between America, Britain, and Japan. And the idea here is they're going to try to reduce militarism by setting a ratio of how many tonnage of battleships can be made. But the ratio is super unequal. It's 5-5-3. For every 5 tons of warship that America makes, Britain can make 5, and Japan can make 3. And the argument is, well, Japan is a tiny island country. They don't need, all that 5. 3 is fine for them. If you're a good critical thinker here, the obvious counterpoint to that is Britain is a tiny island country. It is basically the exact same size as Japan. In fact, Japan might even be a little bit bigger than Britain. So it might make sense to say 5-3-3, right? You might argue, well, America needs a fleet in the Pacific and the Atlantic. It's way bigger. It needs more. That would be reasonable. But it's 5-5-3. So the clear message to Japan through all of this, sometimes just literally what is being said, is you are not equal. You are not white, you are not Western, and we will never treat you as equal, even if your economy is the same as ours. By the way, after World War I, the world's number 1 economy obviously was America. Guess who the world's number 2 economy was? Japan. So economically equal, socially equal, because they established a democracy. In fact, their democracy was based directly off of Europe and American ideals. Militarily equal, they beat Russia, they fought in World War I. But when it comes to the actual, how you're getting treated, the message is consistently not equal, definitely not equal with the racial equality clause, and again, not equal. So Japan's response to this is, the only way we're going to get what we want is to fight for it. And the military at this point has gotten really strong in Japan, because the way they keep on getting things is by fighting. The way they got territory in China was by fighting. The way they got territory in Korea, which is what the Russo-Japanese War was fought over, was by fighting. The way they got even a little bit of territory after World War I was by fighting. So the military becomes crazy popular, and there's 2 branches. There's the Navy and the Army, and they're both focusing on different areas. The Army wants to expand west into China, because how the hell is the Army going to expand east into the Pacific? And the Navy wants to expand east and south into the Pacific, because how the hell is the Navy going to advance west into China? So now they've got these huge military presences that start getting more and more resources, and by 1936, the Japanese government is basically completely controlled by the military. I'm not going to pull up this list because it's kind of a waste of time, but basically what it shows is every prime minister, basically from the early to mid 1930s throughout World War II, is either directly a member of the military or a member of a political party that is super pro-military. The military gets so strong that there is actually the prime minister, whoever they are, has to have a cabinet of people that work with them, right? The cabinet has to include an army official and a navy official. And the army and the navy have to approve those choices. The prime minister cannot become a prime minister until they have a functional cabinet. Again, for our critical thinkers out there, what does that mean? The army and the navy can control the prime minister. If somebody gets elected that they don't like, they just refuse to appoint anybody to that person's cabinet. The Constitution says that the Prime Minister of Japan cannot be Prime Minister if they don't have a functioning cabinet, and if the Army and Navy have to approve their members of the cabinet, their refusal to approve can just mean the Prime Minister never takes office. There is still an emperor of Japan at this point. This is another really big problem we have with American history, because after World War II, we want Japan to be our friend. So we basically say it was all the military's fault, and we remove all of the responsibility from the emperor. The emperor still has a buttload of power. For example, Pearl Harbor. Guess who had to approve Pearl Harbor before it could happen? The emperor. If the emperor said no, Pearl Harbor would not have happened. So yes, the military has huge control over the government, but that does not mean the emperor is guiltless and cannot be blamed. So moving into our direct lead up to World War II for Japan then is Manchuria. Manchuria is basically this area of north/northeast China, and Japan wants to expand into there. but they don't want to be viewed as too aggressive because they know that that will cause problems with the world, especially the League of Nations. At this point, there's some mid-ranking Japanese officers, and there is a lot of historical dispute over whether they were acting on orders from their higher-ups or if they were doing it because there was kind of like this mid-ranking officer mindset at this time period that they should do what was best for Japan no matter what, even if it meant like breaking orders. So they might have been acting on their own. They might have been acting on orders. Either way, there was an explosion on a Japanese-owned railroad because Japan, like most European countries, had economic assets in China because of imperialism. And there was an explosion. And Japan immediately blamed it on Chinese dissidents. They're like, hey, these are anti-Japanese Chinese people that are trying to damage our process here. We have to defend ourselves. The explosion, by the way, was so small that a train went over that part of the railroad a couple hours later with no problems. So it literally did no significant damage at all. But Japan goes, Chinese dissidents did it. We need to come in and put them in their place. They invade Manchuria. They pretty much win immediately because there's no way that Manchuria is standing up to them. But again, they don't want to be viewed as too aggressive. So instead of saying Manchuria is Japanese territory, they say that it is its own independent, air quotes, state called Manchukuo. This is going to be known as the Manchurian Incident, also the Mukden Incident, because the explosion happened at Mukden. So now we've got this independent, definitely not controlled by Japan, puppet state called Manchukuo. Oh man, I used to have a picture in here of their flag. Their seal for Manchukuo. On one side was the flag for Manchukuo, and on the other side was the Japanese imperial flag. So that's how you could tell it's totally independent and not controlled at all by Japan, right? So when you have a covert operation that blatantly obvious, it gets discovered really quick. And in this case, in 1933, Japan's involvement is discovered, and it's brought to the League of Nations, and the League of Nations looks at it and they go, yeah, that's pretty bad. Japan, what are you doing? So they vote. I call it a unanimous vote, and I'll explain why in just a second. They unanimously vote to blame Japan for the invasion and to demand that Manchukuo be given back to China. The reason why I say it's unanimous is because the vote is 42-1, and you'll never guess who the one was. It was Japan. So the only person that voted not guilty for Japan was Japan. When the announcement was made of the results of the vote, in a very dramatic process, the entire Japanese delegation stood up. They grabbed all of their papers and supplies and marched out of the League of Nations. A week later, Japan officially withdraws from the League of Nations, and that's that. Remember, if you will, from European history, the problem with the League of Nations is it was incredibly weak and couldn't actually force anybody to do anything. So Japan never gives up Manchukuo because they're just like, screw you guys, we're going home, and they leave. This is a significant thing, though, because this is Japan's pretty much last diplomatic connection to the West. And what they're saying here is, we're not. We're done. We're not going to deal with this at all. You guys are ridiculous. In fact, do I have the quote here? No, I don't. All right, I'm going to have to paraphrase the quote. The head of the Japanese delegation on the way out says something that has always really resonated with me because it makes a lot of sense. He basically says, would Britain tolerate this control over the Suez Canal? Would America tolerate it over Panama? And basically what he's arguing is, you guys did the exact same thing. You did it in Egypt with the Suez Canal. You did it in Panama with the Panama Canal, and you didn't even really try to hide it. You did it way more blatantly than we did. Where was the League of Nations vote for you? Well, I guess, in those cases it wouldn't be wrong, but where was the international condemnation for you? Where was the outcry from other countries? Where was the demand that you give back that territory? Why are you demanding it now that we are doing it? And keep in mind Japan's history of unfair treatment here. There's a reason why they might react this way, right? So now Japan is out of the League of Nations, and we fast forward a little bit to 1937, And we've got the start of World War II in Asia. In Japan, Europe, the start of World War II is generally viewed as the invasion of Poland, but in Asia, it's viewed as the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. And basically what happens here is Japan had troops in China ever since the Boxer Rebellion at the beginning of the 20th century, just because, imperialism. In 1937, those troops started a training exercise near the Marco Polo Bridge. And a military training exercise is designed to look like, an attack or defensive or, some kind of military maneuver, because that's the whole point. You get your troops all set up and they maneuver, they practice their training, which is why usually if you do this near another country, you let them know. You're like, hey, just a heads up, this is a training maneuver. This is not an attack. We're having our people train, and that's that. And sometimes it's even done as like a show of force, talking about, North and South Korea. America and South Korea routinely do military training activities right on the border of North Korea to like show off our strength to them, right? And we announce it beforehand because we don't want anybody to get the wrong idea. We don't want North Korea thinking we're attacking and then them pushing the button and starting a war and all that stuff. Japan did not give notice. So China freaks out. They're like, oh my God, Japan's attacking us. And they return, air quotes, fire. They fire back because they think they're about to be fired on. There's a short conflict, and at the end of it, pretty much nobody actually ends up getting hurt, but there is a missing Japanese soldier. One soldier is missing. The Japanese demand they get immediate access to all nearby Chinese villages because they're like, we know you kidnapped our soldier. We know you have him. You better give him back. We're going to kill you if you don't. And both sides are freaking out. China's like, we have no idea what you're talking about. They both bring in forces. They reinforce their positions. There is a standoff at Marco Polo Bridge, and somebody shoots. China says it was Japan. Japan says it was China. Either way, fighting breaks out. And after everything is just erupted into complete chaos, the Japanese soldier shows up. Turns out he got lost. He didn't know where he was, and he made it back to his troops. But the war had already started at that point. So if we're talking about the stupidest reasons to fight a war ever, I would like to make a case for the Second Sino-Japanese War and therefore Japan's involvement in World War II, because it was fought over one missing soldier that was not actually missing. He was just lost for a little bit. But realistically, Japan was looking for a reason to fight China. Again, they wanted to take more territory. The way they expected this to work was absolutely steamrolling China, which is what they had done up to this point. And what they wanted to do was bite off a chunk of China, make China surrender, take that territory, and then 5 or so years later, you can find another reason to go to war with them, take another chunk of their territory, and keep on doing that because, especially as Japan, a small island country, it's really hard to consolidate that new territory once you take it. The problem is, China doesn't surrender. So they're getting steamrolled at first, but then Japan gets bogged down. They're stretched way too thin. They can't control the territory they do have. China won't stop fighting. They got way more people. They're getting support from the West. Japan is going to be fighting China until the end of World War II. And much like how we ignore the fact that Russia was responsible for a huge number of casualties for Germany over in Europe, we like to pretend like America fought in the Pacific all on their own. Half of Japan's casualties from 37 to 45 are in China. China is a huge part of World War II in the Pacific, and we pretty much completely ignore them. And yes, they were getting a lot of support from America, but they're still fighting that war basically on their own. So Western countries now are getting pretty pissed off at Japan. And it gets worse in December of 1937 because Japan sinks a U.S. ship. The USS Panay is stationed outside Nanjing. Japan opens fire on it. They immediately apologize. They claim they thought it was Chinese. They pay America money to cover the ship and the soldiers that were killed, but they still sunk an American ship, and that pisses off America. The West is also pissed off, and America's got allies. So the U.S., Britain, and France start giving loans and money to the Chinese government controlled by Chiang Kai-shek, this guy right here. This is stuff that you hopefully talked about with the Chinese Communist Revolution, because Chiang Kai-shek before this had been fighting Mao Zedong, and Mao Zedong is going to get a lot of support through the course of World War II because Chiang Kai-shek is super corrupt and wastes a lot of that money and lets his people starve and just doesn't work out very well. So at this point, we are supporting Japan's enemies, and there starts to be some international economic sanctions. For example, Australia stops Japanese iron mines. That's going to be a big problem because, again, Japan, small island country. And you would think because they're really mountainous that they would have access to a lot of things like iron, but they actually don't. Most of their raw materials that they are using to fuel their military are coming from overseas, like Australian iron mines. So when Australia cuts that off, that's really bad news for them. 1940 rolls around and the war is essentially a stalemate. Look what's going on here, right? So this is all pre-Second Sino-Japanese War. That's Manchuria up there. There's Korea. In 37, they take over a lot of territory. In 38, they take over a little territory. In 39, they take over like no territory. And in 1940, they're actually going to go down here. Because by 1940, they are running into a problem. They can't take any more here. It's taking them months just to take individual cities at this point. They are way too spread out, and they've got to leave troops behind to hold on to their other territory. And they decide, we need resources. If the Western world is cutting off our resources, we're going to run out. And since they won't trade with us, we got to go take more. And Indochina down here has a lot of resources. Maybe we should go take over that. The problem is, France owns Indochina. But France kind of technically doesn't exist because Blitzkrieg and it's 1940. But they still kind of technically do exist because, you know, the whole Free France and Vichy France thing is going on during World War II. So this is quite a big problem for Japan because they invade French Indochina anyway. And people get really mad. This is one of those times in history where it just works out perfectly for naming. Oops. We get the ABCD encirclement. That is the American, British, Chinese, and Dutch encirclement, where basically we start embargoing all the things they need to run their military. Iron ore, steel, oil, rubber, anything that they might need, we're going to start cutting that off bit by bit. Japan gets really worried. And they go, oh, crap, that's bad because we import 90% of our oil and 80% of that imported oil is just from America. So a grand total of, I'm not going to do math in my head because I'm just going to embarrass myself. Let's say like 75%-ish of their oil is just coming from America. So when that ABCD encirclement starts cutting things off, Japan starts realizing, well, we're going to run out of resources. This is really bad. And they try to negotiate. They come to the West and they're like, look, guys, our bad. We thought that nobody would really care if we invaded. We kind of felt like France was, doing their own thing and that this was Asia and we were going to go for it. Clearly, we misread the situation. Our bad. How about we kind of back off and you guys lift those embargoes? And these negotiations fail, mostly because America rolls in, and America from the get-go is going to have a really clear demand. They go, all right, how about this? Unconditional surrender. This is the same line America is going to repeat all through World War II. The war could have ended way earlier if we did not demand on this, but we start from the get-go. We go, you're not just going to leave French Indochina. You're going to leave Indochina. You're going to leave China. You're going to leave Manchuria. You're going to leave Korea. You're going to go back home to Japan, and you are going to promise to never invade anybody ever again. And Japan goes, all right, let us think about our options here. And then they invade the rest of Indochina. So you can see by 1942, the rest of this has been invaded. This makes the West even more mad, and there is a complete oil embargo and a total freeze of all Japanese assets in the West. Basically what that means is if a Japanese business has like money in an American bank, for example, they cannot access that money. It's cut off. It's seized by the government. At this point, Japan negotiates again, and specifically they're going to America at this point, and they're like, hey, our bad. We misunderstood what you said earlier, like language barrier. What we thought you said was invade the rest of Indochina. And it turns out what you actually said was don't invade the rest of Indochina. Oops, silly mistake. I understand. How about we give Indochina back to France and you start trading oil with us again? And America goes, I got a counter offer for you. Complete unconditional surrender. You leave Indochina, you leave China, you leave Manchuria, you leave Korea, you go back to Japan, and you make a promise to never attack anybody ever again. Japan goes, all right, let me think about it. This is Japan at this point. If you are Japan, what are your options? The West is no longer trading with you. And diplomacy has been increasingly impossible to the point where the only way you're going to get anything is to basically go back to Japan. And you know from watching what happened to the rest of Asia, if you do that, you are going to become somebody's colony. They're never going to treat you equally. They're going to try to take you over, and you are going to lose any presence you have in the world. But if you continue doing what you're doing, you're going to piss off the West even more. And they're not going to trade your resources anymore. And the only way you can get resources then is to take military action, because you're going to have to invade other countries to take those resources if nobody will trade them with you. So they're going to take the second option. And going back to what I said earlier when I talk about, this is coming out of the blue, this is, again, Dr. Seuss. These cartoons were published before Pearl Harbor. If some random political cartoonist could predict this coming, you better bet the American government knew it was a possibility. So we got final warning, you give me a brick to bean you with, or I'll paste you with a pie. We got the end of the nap right here, where Japan is attacking America, and that's just the APUSH stuff. So Japan then follows through with Pearl Harbor. They attack America because basically what they identify is the problem is America. Britain and France and all of them are busy fighting in Europe. If we start taking over Southeast Asia, the Philippines, going after Malaysia, all that stuff, Europe's not going to be able to do anything. It's going to be America. So if we take out America's navy, it's going to be just like with Russia. How are you going to fight us without a navy? Pearl Harbor is never about taking over America. It's not about fighting America long term. The idea of Pearl Harbor is Japan wants to roll in, blow up America's entire Pacific fleet and our ability to, support our Pacific fleet, and then go to America and go, hey, how do you feel about some diplomacy now? And then do whatever they want in Asia. Unfortunately for them, they kind of screw up, and it's a really big luck-based thing. America had 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific that were stationed at Pearl Harbor that were supposed to be at Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack. By complete random chance, all 3 of them were gone. One had been sent back to San Diego for repairs, one was transporting troops to an island in the Pacific, and one was out on patrol. That all 3 of those things were not scheduled, so Japan's intel was the 3 aircraft carriers are supposed to be there. Because the aircraft carriers were gone, the general in charge of the attack called it off 1 wave early. There was 3 waves to it. The 3rd one was supposed to damage the dry docks, which is where we repaired our ships. If the dry dock in Pearl Harbor was destroyed, the closest dry dock was on the west coast of America. And how are you going to get all your damaged ships all the way from Hawaii to the west coast of America? You wouldn't. But he called off the 3rd wave because he decided the 1st and 2nd one had done enough damage, and because he didn't know where the American aircraft carriers were, he didn't want to risk them coming back, and catching the Japanese off guard. So by the end of the war, we had repaired pretty much every ship damaged, not every ship, pretty much every ship damaged at Pearl Harbor, and our aircraft carriers completely destroyed them. So sucks for Japan. Let me pull up a different PowerPoint really quick here. I mention all of this because this is what leads to Japan having complete dominance over Korea and the region at large there. And this does have a direct connection. I mentioned that I wanted to talk to you guys about this stuff to tie into some kind of modern issues in this region. And a big part of that is what Japan does with that control. So some of these images are going to be pretty graphic, just a heads up. I always say this is Bataan Death March, but I've had several students tell me it's actually Bataan. Bataan. The Bataan Death March. I'm just going to say Bataan Death March because I'm a white dude from America. That's how we say Bataan. The Bataan Death March is American soldiers, but primarily Filipino soldiers that have been captured because part of Pearl Harbor attack is also attacking the Philippines and kicking America out because we had a base there. And it was a horrendous example of how Japan treated POWs in general. For reference, Japan basically drilled the idea of using a bastardized version of Bushido into their soldiers. And basically they said that if you surrendered, you lost all honor. And if you didn't have honor, you basically weren't human and you didn't need to be treated as human. So they were horrendously bad to POWs and treated them basically as subhuman. They marched these people thousands of miles in the heat with limited water, limited supplies, limited rest. If you stopped or slowed down when they didn't want you to, they would beat you or stab you in the legs with bayonets. Like you can see here, they're actually stabbing them in the back. But if you fell down, you would basically be killed. Soldiers would get to the point where as they were walking like this, you'd have like 3 people in a line. And you'd have one guy in the middle that was basically being carried by the other 2 guys so he could sleep while they walked. And then you would rotate positions because they didn't give them enough time to rest or anything like that. When they got to the end of the forced march, there were also periodic executions like this. Primarily the people that were executed like this were actually the Filipino soldiers. This one shows an American soldier, but a Japanese officer would occasionally stop and just behead people. Beheading is a terrible way to die, by the way, especially by people who are not trained. Like these officers didn't train with swords. It could take you several swings to even get through the neck, and that's assuming you didn't accidentally hit like the shoulders or the back first because your aim is bad. When they finally got done with this march, they were put in an incredibly overcrowded camp without enough medical supplies and with very, these are obviously drawings from soldiers that were there. You get tainted water, like dead bodies in the water, which gives you horrible diseases. The soldiers that were, or the POWs that were marched there, were not given medical treatment or supplies. So way more people actually died in the camp than died on the march. These are not soldiers from Bataan, but they are American POWs that were rescued from Japan after the end of the war. And just, you can see complete starvation. This is the result of Japan's treatment of POWs during World War II. That is more of like an American well-known thing. These other ones are much more, for Asia, more important, because they are the ones that affect Asia directly, and they're the ones that tie into our modern stuff. The first one is Unit 731, which most people know that the Nazis did human experimentation. Unit 731 is Japan's human experimentation, and it was a biological and chemical warfare research unit. And they would basically kidnap Koreans, Chinese, Russians, anybody who was in their sphere of influence, and use them for experimentation. Like tying them to stakes and testing like the effects of flamethrowers from different distances. So like you were tied to a wooden stake so you couldn't get away, and they would flamethrower people from different distances to see what happened. They tested hypothermia by intentionally throwing people into freezing water. They tested frostbite. They tested all kinds of like actual diseases on people, including STDs. There was a lot of sexual assault and things like that. They sprayed people with various chemicals. They basically just tortured and killed thousands and thousands of people. There's multiple records made where they refer to people as logs. So they would say like, that we got rid of the last batch, bring in a new batch of logs. So these are all dead bodies as a result of their experimentation. I didn't include the picture of their compounds. They actually screwed themselves over, because they made these compounds to withstand bombing runs, because America was bombing them. And when they started losing ground in northern China, which is where a lot of these facilities were, they didn't want people to find out about it because they knew it was a war crime. They knew they would get in trouble for it. So they tried to blow up the facilities as they left. But because they had made them to withstand bombings, they couldn't completely destroy them. They also couldn't really get rid of everybody that knew what was going on. So we found out about this. And this is another unfortunate side of America. The Nuremberg trials in Europe are very famous, and the Nazi medical experimenters were put on trial there. And the decision was that it was unethical to use their research, even if it could, benefit us, because it would encourage in the future people to do that same kind of research. And you can't encourage human experimentation. Well, Unit 731 was pretty secret, and not many people knew about it. So America actually helped keep this a secret so that we could use the research that they had found. Which is one of the reasons why Unit 731 is not that well known in America, because after World War II, we actively helped cover it up so we could use their research. Comfort women is a thing that mainly affected Korea, but also affected North China as well, and again, some limited number of Europeans, also Filipinos. Comfort women is a very euphemistic way of saying forced prostitution. These women would be kidnapped or told that they were reporting for a factory job so they could get money for their family. And when they showed up, there was no factory. And they were thrown into a complex with guards that would shoot them if they tried to leave. And Japanese soldiers can come at any time and utilize their services, rape them, more or less. These women were basically just brought in on trucks like livestock, like they weren't even people. They were kept in these camps. And again, as the war ended, Japan tried to like leave, and they actually ended up killing a lot of people to try to kind of hide this. But again, everybody around knew what was going on. Horrifically, if a woman got pregnant, oftentimes it would just be forcefully aborted. If she did carry it to term, if it was a boy, oftentimes the baby would just be immediately killed. Sometimes, if it was a girl, they would actually keep her alive because they did not only target women. There were children who were also forced into this process. In a particularly adding insult to injury moment, especially in Korea, because the local communities knew what was going on, when the war was over and these women came back to their communities, their families and their neighbors and their friends knew what had happened to them, and they blamed the women. They told them that they were unclean, that they were dirty, their families disowned them, their communities shunned them, they were basically pushed out of society, and a lot of them, this is, after the war, this is a community house basically for ex-comfort women, where they are given some form of support. They have like activities they do together to try to recover, because society completely abandoned them and basically just left them as unclean and unwanted. And it wasn't until very recently in South Korea where the government actually apologized for that, and that image has been kind of, they're attempting to fix it. But for decades, these women were just left on their own with no support from their family or friends after they just got through dealing with trauma that was not their fault, and they were just left alone with it. Finally, we have, I wouldn't say it's the worst one, but I do think it's one of the worst single incidences that Japan did. Like comfort women, for example, as a whole, way more people were affected by that than were affected by this. But it was spread out over the course of the war, and any one incident was much more contained, whereas the rape in Nanking is just sheer brutality on an almost unimaginable scale. You might sometimes see Nanking spelled as Nanjing. We have hard time spelling Chinese words in English. So Nanking was a city that stood up against Japan for several months before they were captured. And when the Japanese took it over, they were apparently feeling very frustrated, and they decided the best way to deal with that was to destroy the city. And obviously there was physical destruction like what you see here, but they also, especially Chinese soldiers, even after they surrendered, the Japanese soldiers would hunt down the Chinese soldiers and kill them, even if they were not fighting anymore. They rounded up civilians and killed them. As you can see here, some of these guys are wearing uniforms, but a lot of them are just civilians that are being rounded up and killed. A lot of them were beheaded. There is actually a documented example of this, and this one in particular, I include some of the more graphic pictures and mention documentation because there are some very right-wing nationals in Japan that insist this is all fake. In the same way that some people insist the Holocaust is all made up, they insist that none of this is real, it's all lies by the Chinese, and all of these pictures are photoshopped and they're not really real, and it never happened. But we have direct documentation from soldiers that were there that it did happen. We also have, when it comes to beheading like this, Japanese newspapers at the time actually published a competition between two Japanese lieutenants to see who could be the first one to behead 100 people. And every day they would publish an update to, who was in the lead and who had how many numbers. Midway through, they lost count and they started over from zero. So it's kind of hard to argue that this didn't happen when we not only have photographic evidence, we also have from that time period direct recorded sources of it. We have soldiers who write about it in their journals. We have soldiers who after the fact talk about it. Soldiers took home trophies. Like they'd behead somebody, then they would boil off all the flesh, and they actually brought home skulls of Chinese people and brought them to their homes as a souvenir after all this. People were used for target practice with bayonets. You can see these people down here are still alive, and they're basically being put up against a wall, and the soldiers would just bayonet them to death. They would intentionally aim for non-vital areas to keep them alive for as long as possible because they wanted them to try to squirm away from the bayonet because they wanted to, heavy air quotes, practice their bayonet skills. They would also force people to dig their own graves and then just mass kill them and then just bury them in those graves. There's more bayoneting going on here. There's a really disturbing picture coming up in a minute here. I don't know if it's the next one or not. Yeah, that one. Children were not spared from this either. That is not a doll. That is a child. She was murdered, just flat out. On top of that, really horrendous sexual assault was done. Women were obviously raped extensively, but really just absolutely depraved stuff. There were a lot of Buddhist monks in China, and basically Japanese soldiers would find them and force them to rape people. What they would tell them is basically either you rape these people or we are going to torture you all to death right here. They would make fathers or sons rape their children or their mothers with the same threat. They would basically torture people to death with sexual assault. It's just really the amount of depravity it would take to think of the stuff they did is just is mind-boggling. So by the end of this, the generally accepted numbers is anywhere from 200 to 300,000 Chinese people were killed at Nanking over the course of a couple of weeks. It had mostly died down within that time period. Obviously, there's a huge range to that. The right-wing nationalists would insist that number is zero because it never happened. On the other side, you have super nationalist Chinese people that are it was over 2 million. Well, there wasn't even over 2 million people in the city at that time. So it would be very hard for that number to be over 2 million. All of this goes into, though, the modern connection I wanted to get to, which is Japan's relationship with its neighbors. Because remember, Korea and China are their neighbors, as are the Philippines, kind of. And those were the victims of this stuff. And I always use Germany and Japan as the examples of the two extremes you could have for dealing with atrocities. Germany has dealt with Nazism incredibly well. They have owned up to it. They have extensively apologized to it. They have made reparations for it. There's monuments and all these stuff put up throughout Germany. They have outlawed Nazism. You could actually be ticketed for even doing a Nazi salute in Germany. And then you have Japan. And their diplomatic relations with their neighbors are very damaged by the fact that they are notorious for not owning up to their atrocities. They've kind of owned up to the POW stuff because, again, they wanted to be America's friends, and that's the one that affected us most directly, so we demanded that they own up to that. But Unit 731, for example, Japan still consistently argues that maybe it happened, but there's not really enough evidence, and it's not really clear, so they're not going to officially recognize it because there's no proof that it definitely happened, even though we have the facilities and we have eyewitness accounts. But there's no clear evidence, so they don't have to own up to that one, according to them. A general verbal apology was given for comfort women. And it's actually been given once or twice, but there's never been a written apology. There's never been a specific apology. It's more along the lines of I'm sorry that some bad sexual stuff happened during the war. And that is constantly undermined by things like in 2014, the head of the NHK is a Japanese government-run broadcasting company. So this is a government official because he's the head of a government broadcasting corporation, went on the record as saying comfort women wasn't actually that bad because everybody does stuff like that during war. So basically, Japan here is that person, I don't know if any of you have a friend that just cannot apologize for stuff, and if they do apologize, it's I'm sorry that you got mad about what I did, and they clearly don't mean it. That's Japan with comfort women. POWs, like I said, they've gotten some apologies about that. In 95, the prime minister, this guy right here, apologized just overall for Japan's wartime stuff. Didn't reference the rape in Nanjing at all. Didn't really reference specific stuff in general. Again, no written apology has ever been given. Japan's government continues to use the very conservative casualty estimates when they talk about any of these. They basically use the lowest number possible. A bunch of right-wing politicians, as I mentioned previously, insist that a lot of it never even happened. If you look at Japanese history textbooks, things like the rape in Nanjing, they'll be a side note or a footnote, right? They'll talk about Japan did some bad stuff during the war, and there'll be a footnote, and it'll say something like there are claims that Japan massacred a village in China or a city in China. So it's really not an apology at all. On top of that, we have this guy right here, Abe. Oh man. He's been prime minister of Japan since I lived in Japan, so good 8 years now. There is a very famous shrine in Tokyo called the Yasukuni Shrine, and it is frequently visited by government officials like Abe himself right here. And the problem with that is shrines in Japan kind of house the dead, right? They're shrines to the dead, and you list the people that are enshrined there. Yasukuni enshrines 1,068 war criminals from World War II. 14 of them are Class A war criminals, which is basically the highest you can get. They're really, really, really bad war criminals. That shrine is frequently visited by Japanese politicians. And the argument is, well, we're not honoring the war criminals, we're honoring all the other people that are enshrined at Yasukuni. Problem with that is there is a shrine directly across the way that honors all the people that Yasukuni does, but specifically leaves out the war criminals. And they go to Yasukuni, not the other one. Abe, notably, has visited Yasukuni Shrine multiple times, on some cases actually before meetings with Korean or Chinese politicians. And in 2015, he publicly stated that Japan would no longer apologize for anything from World War II because they've already apologized, even though, again, they haven't, and they should not be predestined to keep apologizing for their past. So you might occasionally hear in the news, I don't think I have another slide. You might occasionally hear in the news about how, relations between, Japan and South Korea or Japan and China are really bumpy. A lot of that is territorial stuff, but the base is this right here. South Korea and China just kind of hate Japan in general, primarily for how they were treated during World War II, and Japan has done the worst job possible trying to acknowledge and apologize for and make up for all that stuff they did. So you look, it's really weird. You got South Korea and Japan. They're both really close allies of America and Asia, but they kind of hate each other. And it's mostly Japan's fault. So that's all of our stuff for this week. Like I said, it's kind of random topics, and it's going to be about the amount of stuff we can fit in one class period. So next week, we will get more directly into Korea, especially North Korea. We will probably have you guys watch a video. It's going to depend on whether or not we do the summative assessment thing that I'm going to put up the survey for. But thank you guys for listening. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you. Bye.